Jason Hamacher joins me here in Studio Q. Pleasure to meet you.
Thanks for having me.
So, Jason, how did these Syrian chants first get on your radar? I understand you confused Syria with Serbia.
Yeah. So I'd actually been to the region before in 2002.
Okay.
In 2001 and 2002, I'd been to Egypt, Israel, Palestine, and then I was going to go up through in Jordan and go up through Syria and Turkey, and then through a series of tragedies, I had to go home early.
Okay.
Never expecting to return. The next year, I had a second opportunity to go on tour and had 2 weeks off and went. I was trying to get sponsored by a cymbal company called Istanbul. So I was like, I'm going to come, just like today. It's like, I'm coming to your headquarters in Istanbul. I've got some time.
Okay.
And so I ended up going to deep eastern Turkey. And that is, depending on which historian you like to talk to, that is classic Armenia. Or historical Armenia before World War I. And that is where I kind of discovered, for the first time, I heard that the Syrian Orthodox Church existed. That church chants in Aramaic, or a form of Aramaic, Jesus' language. Mm-hmm. And that was the stronghold for the Armenian community as well. And the thing that's interesting, the city of Urfa, which is where the Christian chants that I ended up recording for the Smithsonian, that is the tradition they come out of. That's considered the first Christian city. They're the first group of people to claim belief as a city.
Okay.
And then Armenia is the first country, like kingdom, that claimed Christianity.
Okay. So you were discovering this a little over 10 years ago?
A little over 10 years ago. And then what ended up happening was, of me falling into doing all of this, was I wanted to form an orchestra of rock musicians. Essentially, instead of approaching music as stereotypical 4/4 or something a little bit more angular like Frodis would have done, is to do these big sweeping orchestral attempts to make music for a vocal tradition that had never had musical accompaniment. And so
ambitious.
Very ambitious. Yeah. But essentially my band broke up. Mm-hmm. And anytime you're dealing with loss, whether it's the loss of a loved one, a community culture band, whatever, you have to make a decision. Like, what do you do? Like, do you do what you're used to doing? Do you do the easy thing? Do you start over and or do you try to challenge yourself and grow? Mm-hmm. And at that point in my life, I was fed up with playing nightclubs, or fed up is a little too strong.
Yeah. But you were looking for a new challenge creatively.
Exactly. I wanted to push myself and play something like the Kennedy Center or an opera space as opposed to a nightclub.
The typical places you play
exactly.
in a hardcore punk band.
Exactly.
So where are we in the timeline here? You're starting a new band. You're looking for new inspiration. How far along are we from that initial visit to Eastern Turkey and that region and learning about that history?
This is 3 years later.
3 years later.
This is 3 years later. This is 2005.
Okay.
Right.
And what about this confusion between Syria and Serbia? Where did
so
that
at
come
the
in?
at the end of a dinner party, we all kind of charged ourselves to go online and find an ancient form of vocal tradition. Faith was not a part of it. Mm-hmm. And then kind of like email at each other and then try to come up with some parts. It was 2 drummers and a keyboardist. That is not a recipe for anything creatively, anything exciting, essentially. I was like, we got to add some chanting or something in this. Like, let's see what we can figure out. Mm-hmm. And so I was driving through D.C., and that's what happened. A friend of mine called, found some amazing Serbian chant on the internet. And he was like, man, I found this awesome chant from Serbia.
Like, this might be some good inspiration.
Yeah, let's do this. And I was like, I'd never been to Syria. That's incredible. And so he's like, no, I said Serbia. I was like, man, I always was supposed to go. Like, I just completely lost me at that point. And then right by my house, there's a tunnel. And so I went through the tunnel, the phone call dropped, and then my mind just started racing 1,000,000 miles a minute. It's like, oh, I read this book where this guy found this ancient Christian music out in the desert. We got to jam to that. That's what we're going to do. And then literally it was maybe 25 seconds later, I called my friend Bill back. It's like, yo, man, remember that chant where the guy was in the deserts of Syria? It's the world's oldest Christian music. And Bill was like, I said Serbia. And so that whole miscommunication led to everything
So
happening.
you went to Syria to document this music. Can you talk about the first time you ever heard these chants in Syria?
The first time I heard these chants, it was a very political time in Syria. I was supposed to go in February of 2006. That was the time that the Danish cartoonist published, and that whole riot happened in Middle East, started kicked off in Damascus. So my initial trip was cut, actually.
Wow.
So I wasn't sure if the project would ever happen. I was told by the archbishop, "You're not allowed to come. It's not safe, and I'll let you know when to come." And so what ended up happening was he called me 10 days later and said, "I think it's okay. Come on over." And so going, the church is not an old church. These people are actually refugees from the Armenian genocide of World War I. They used to be in the city of Urfa, and they fled. So part of that first trip was I didn't have any idea what to expect. Is it a big cathedral? Is it a church? Is this going to be 1,500 years old? And the answer was it was 70 years old, made out of extremely amazing white stone. And then going into the church service, even inside the city of Aleppo, this is the only building on earth where it's done. This one tradition is not sung at any other Syrian Orthodox church anywhere.
Why
And
is that?
because that is the only it's a very small minority enclave inside of the minority enclave inside of the minority enclave.
And what was your first impression of that sound?
Awe, just like I was saying, like growing up in the church and faith component out of it, like the history of what I was hearing was so overwhelming that I just had to sit down, to be honest.
Why is this music so important?
This music is so important not because it's essentially an ancient artifact, but because it is a living representation of a culture that has existed for nearly 2 millennia that is completely being wiped out. And so one of the things that I've been trying to do, and I'm constantly questioning why am I doing this? Why am I spending so much time on it? And it's not just because no one else is doing it. It's because this puts a face to everything that has been happening in Syria. Like, it's really easy to look at a dead 3-year-old in the waves and feel like you want to do a call to action, you want to help. But what if that kid's parents? Everyone looks at that kid's parents and just doesn't care. Everyone looks at their aunts and uncles running across the border and they don't care. So essentially what I'm hopefully trying to do is put a human face by exposing the beauty of the culture, the beauty of not just the relationships of these people to their faith, to the history of the world, but just these people.
Just more generally, their humanity, because
Sure.
some people might not be moved by. Some
Right.
people out there aren't moved by anything else.
Sure. And that wasn't my initial goal. Like, as everything has just gotten worse and worse, the scope of what I'm doing changes over time.
Were you surprised that no one else had recorded this ancient music before?
I was completely surprised. It was kind of hilarious. I mean, it was just like, so to tell you the point, the decision point, I had emailed the author of the book, William Dalrymple. He was the one that described this music in a book. And I was like, I want to get a copy of this. He's like, I don't know. I don't think there is one. If you ever go to Syria, this is what you tell a taxi driver at the airport. I was like, okay. Well, that's not happening. And then he said it was Syrian Orthodox. And on that trip in 2002, that's where I was first exposed to that community. And so I found an email address, info@SyrianOrthodoxChurch.org. And there was no website, just an email address. And so I just put, these are the bands I used to be in. This is the places I've been. I would love to get a copy of this. And 2 days later, the archbishop of the church for the United States emailed me back, this is a great idea. Why don't you call me? And on the phone, he said, I don't have the traditions you're looking for. I have something that sounds similar, but it's not the same. It's like, well, how do I get what I'm looking for?
Yeah.
He's like, well, just don't have it. I was like, I'm willing to pay whatever it costs to get it imported into the United States. So well, we just don't have a copy of it. I was like, as in we with a capital W, like humanity does not have a recording, a professional recording of the world's earliest Christian tradition. And he said, no. And that's when I said, do you want me to make one for you? And he was like, do you know how? I was like, yeah, I can make an album. I've made like 10. He's like, yeah, why don't you put together a proposal and come up and meet with me and we'll figure it out. And that's kind of what started. And then what led to all the other albums, the Sufi album and the Armenian, the 40 Martyr albums, was I went to Syria for years, back and forth, going in and out of D.C. And I just had some downtime in 2010. I actually was, one of the biggest projects I did was I was photographing, assessing, and documenting all of the Jewish properties in north of Syria for a museum in New York.
Wow. So it wasn't just a musical project.
It transformed into all kinds of other things. So essentially, I'll back up a little bit. In 2007, after my first trip, I came up with my official proposal. How do I record all this?
Okay. For the archbishop of the Syrian Orthodox Church?
Yep. No,
Okay.
for the government of Syria.
For the
Like
government.
I got the permission from the archbishop to do it.
Okay.
Then I had to get the permission from the Syrian government to do it. You can't just, it's a dictatorship. You can't just roll in with like a studio and gear. Although I tried, but
You got to go through the protocols.
yeah. And so what ended up happening was it took 8 months and someone finally read my proposal. I was immediately ushered in and was sat down with the Syrian ambassador of the United States. And he looked over the proposals like, this is a great idea. Yes, to everything. And part of it was I wanted to photograph their exile route. They were part of the genocide, the Armenian genocide, like I was talking about. So I wanted to photograph the exile route in reverse. And the ambassador's like, oh, I'm a huge photography fan. I'd love to see your work. Why don't you come back and show me? And then being completely ignorant to diplomacy or not being a politician, I brought this book that I made. It's about 100 pages that he thought was a gift
Okay.
that I did not deem worthy enough to be a gift. So I came in and he was like, I love this. Thank you so much. And I was like, oh, well, it's not actually, there's a lot of mistakes in there. Just kind of look at the imagery. But essentially, he looked at the book and was like, I love this. Let's make this commercially available. I want you to make a book on the city of Aleppo.
So how open and willing were people to share their culture with you and have it recorded like that?
Extremely. Kind of shockingly. Like, I'm making it sound a little easier, like a walk in the park, but I mean, going over first as a bishop, like as a official guest of the Archbishop of Aleppo was I didn't recognize it at first. That came with a lot of people responded to me being a guest of the church with a capital C.
So that opened doors.
Lots of doors.
What impact has the conflict in Syria had on this music?
Well, for the 40 Martyrs, 2 days after I released the album, the church was blown up. Wow. Yeah. And so all the people that do this music, all the people that practice this music are fleeing. Like the language of 40 Martyrs is before the war was on UNESCO's endangered list. So it was scheduled to completely disappear in a generation or two. It's Western Armenian. You've got Eastern and Western Armenian. I'm positive that number has, it could be gone in a decade or two. That's conjecture on my end. But you've got all these different faith traditions. Everyone's either leaving or being killed. There was a just wave of international news on the blowing up of this church. Fortunately, it wasn't the main building. It was kind of a compound. The middle, like the courtyard, got blown up. So all the ancient relics and things like that. And what was important and was kind of it was a metaphor for the entire region is that neighborhood, it's called Shad, is traditionally held as the Christian quarter. But it was, and this is all in the liner notes for the album, it was actually renovated in the late 1600s by a very prominent Armenian and Islamic, and several faith groups came together and renovated the entire neighborhood. Yeah. And for years, up until the war. That's what, like, you wanted to
It
go
was
to.
a multi-faith environment.
Well, it was a multi-faith environment, but the thing that was amazing about Syria is faith had no part in everyday living. Like, it wasn't like people just lived. It was one of the most diverse cities in the Middle East, and it has been for millennia.
I was telling you, I spoke with Malik Jandali, a
Yeah.
Syrian composer, and he was describing some of this history, this multi-faith history, also the incredible musical history.
Yeah, it's incredible.
And it is very sad to see it get lost like this. I also heard that the archbishop who helped you has been kidnapped.
Yeah, it was the night, I think it was April 22nd, 2013. It was 2 days before our big meeting with the Smithsonian, actually. So it was the Greek Orthodox and the Syrian Orthodox archbishop. The Greek Orthodox archbishop was doing a humanitarian aid mission up on, like, the Turkish border.
Okay.
And to put it in driving distances, it's like an hour and a half away. It's not far. But he was kind of nervous about returning. So he called Bishop Johanna, the gentleman I lived with, and he was like, I will come get you, and, kind of safety in numbers, I'll pick you up. And there's a series of amazing villages, Byzantine villages called the Dead Cities, that are just ruins, and you just kind of weave in and out of the, and it's just an incredible experience. But that's where you got to get around. So they were going through those, and you can't fly through those; they're kind of slow weave. They were surrounded by a group of terrorists, and the driver was pulled out and executed on the spot, and they just got in the car and left.
They're still missing.
Still missing. And so the archbishop that has dealt with me on all of my work, he's now the patriarch of the church for the entire world. The Bishop Johanna, the Syrian Orthodox patriarch died of natural causes, I believe, in Germany last year.
Okay.
Or a year and a half ago. And then Bishop Johanna most likely would have been the patriarch of the church, but he's gone. So the patriarch, the archbishop from the United States,
is now the patriarch.
More Ephraim.
I'm speaking with Jason Hamacher, the hardcore punk drummer who has been preserving ancient Christian chants from Syria. So this has just grown as a project. Stumbled upon it half by accident, mishearing your friend. The importance of preserving these chants has just grown for you.
Right.
But you said you still question it from time to time.
Yeah. It's funny, I wrote someone a text message on the train into this studio about it. I feel conflicted a little bit about being the guy that stumbled into this. Meaning, why am I the person that has the archive? And it's not necessarily a guilt trip as so much as someone asked me the other day, why do you do this? And I didn't have an answer. The only thing I could think of is because it needs to be done.
Feels meaningful.
I mean, it feels meaningful, but it's one of those things. And I think this may be part of my musical background too. It's you do something because you do it, not because it's like a gut instinct. You just do it. Does that make sense?
I'm a musician. It makes sense to me.
But do you know what I mean?
Yeah.
Like I am not a part of, like, a lot of the decision making process for me is not monetarily based. Meaning, and that works for and against me, but the rationale behind my decisions with all of this initially came from, it makes no sense, no one has done this.
Yeah.
And to take it back, there is extreme amounts of academic research on almost all of these communities. So what I've been trying to do for someone like me or you that is interested in music is to build a bridge between the uninterested, the apathetic, to the scholarship. And that's where I come in with all of the...
Well, I think it's like that with a lot of things in life. You do sort of stumble upon the work, but it doesn't make it any less meaningful or anything. What kind of responsibility do you feel? Does it ever feel like a burden?
Burden, no. Responsibility, yes. I'll put it in perspective. One of my good friends is an amazing artist from the city of Aleppo. His family has lived in that place for 750 years. I started working on my book again, and I was having trouble remembering the name of a building. So I was on Facebook chat with him.
Okay.
When the war broke out in his front yard, like the war came to Aleppo while I was communicating with him. And he was like, dude, there are shots on my street. I was like, should you be on the computer? Like, do you want to get off the computer? And he basically said, he was like, look, if I don't make it tonight, it's your responsibility. He's like, it's your responsibility to show people how amazing our place is.
That's heavy.
It was super heavy. Like, I actually couldn't handle it. And I was like, I'll do whatever I can. I'll do my best. So I've got this huge, huge photographic archive that's turned into the book. I've got these 5 albums. He actually did the artwork for the Sufi album. But it's just, I have he's one of them, a very close cabinet of friends and Syrians to kind of bounce my ideas off of and make sure that I'm representing the essence of what the place is as opposed to Jason Hamacher's interpretation.
Yeah, do you ever get worried about that? The perception that
Yeah.
people might think you're, sort of taking advantage of these communities?
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
Because of that, I stopped working on all of this. Like when the war started, I stopped actually.
It felt like too much.
Well, I just didn't want before the war, no one cared. I have a book of nearly invaluable photographs now that no publisher would touch beforehand. It just wasn't profitable. And so the fact that these images or these sounds may be profitable to an organization makes me irate. That's like my hair, like the punk rock inside of me is like, oh, I'm going to do it myself. And so I stopped working on everything. And essentially what happened was, as the news just increased and got more and the war just got worse and worse and worse, I started to field questions all the time. You've been to Syria. Is that really like that? I'm like, absolutely not. Like, it's not. This is not what it is. This is not what it's like. And then the pivotal moment was I had a friend come up to me from Richmond. He's like, we need to have a discussion. I'm taking you out to lunch. And he was like, I have so many people asking me about you that don't know you, about all these things that you have. This was 2 years ago. He's like, you need to do something. I was like, I am. I've got this book. I've got this CD. He's like, you have so much other stuff. He's like, when is your book and CD coming out? I was like, I don't know. He's like, do something. I was like what? He's like, I don't know. Don't you have other recordings? And so I was like, fine, I'll do something. And so that's what spawned the whole Lost Origin sound series, was me just kind of being challenged by a friend and then going through and picking through my archive and finding these 4 albums that I felt were kind of a good definitive cross-section of the city, and then figuring out a way to artistically represent those traditions.
And give people a truer sense of the place.
Yeah.
You brought up the punk rock in you.
Yeah.
Is that part of what makes you a sort of an archivist? I know a lot of punk rock heads that are really fans of music and they learn about music. They care about history. Mm-hmm. Do you think that's where it comes from?
Part of it. I got into world music in quotation marks from being straight edge and being on tour and not drinking and digging through record crates all over the earth and finding really cool looking records and just buying them because they looked neat and they had a whole bunch of information inside of them.
I'd imagine some of the interest in justice as well comes from that punk tradition.
Yeah. Exactly.
You spent a long time in Syria documenting this music. Is there one memory of your time that really sticks out for you?
One memory.
Is there one what's the first one that comes to mind?
Getting inside the ancient synagogue. It was allegedly built by King David's general. The current structure is 1,600 years old, and it is the longest original use construction in the entire city. Meaning, there's a church. There's a prayer hall that was a 4th century church that used to be this and that. The ancient synagogue inside Aleppo has only been a synagogue, and it happened just randomly on a day. I was attending this was in 2006. I was attending a series of meetings with Bishop Johanna, and it was intense, man. Like, he was like, I just want you to see how my day operates. And I can't speak Arabic at all. So I'm just sitting there listening and watching.
Yeah.
And it was everything from an elderly woman that just lost her husband to literally the Prince of Greece and I've never met royalty. It's Prince Michael, my sister.
He's speaking to all these people.
Yeah, they're just like coming in, meeting and hanging out, talking about whatever, in and out. And so as we're sitting there, just randomly an elderly gentleman walks in, looked kind of lost. I was like, what's up with this guy? And then the bishop just breaks speaking and goes, this is the last Jewish man in the north of Syria, and just keeps talking. I'm like,
wow,
no big deal. And someone had told me that there was this synagogue. And so I asked him about it, and he was like, do you want to go see it? And so I went in to see it. And it was incredible. And I photographed the whole thing, and I didn't really understand what I had just seen. It is a very, very coveted place. You're not allowed in. It's protected by the military. It's protected by the police, like all these different things. And so being that I was there with a community member, he could just let us in. And that, I mean, everything related to Syria kind of was life-changing, but that specifically was pivotal.
King David, that is going back.
Yeah. OG.
Do you imagine you'll ever go back to Aleppo?
I imagine. I don't know if it ever happened.
No.
I mean, it's just not safe. Like and that's kind of the upsetting part for, I'm sure, people like Malik and everyone else. It's like what they know doesn't exist. And I'm not talking about the buildings. There was a huge earthquake in Aleppo in the late 1800s that leveled the city. A lot of the city is rebuilt. Some of the original structures are still there, but a lot of the city is rebuilt. The people are what made that place incredible. And it was something that I wasn't sure if it was a unique experience to myself because I was guests of these people, but everyone I've ever talked to that either lived there or has family there or spent any time there has had this transformative experience. There is a poem in the 40 Martyrs album that summarizes it perfectly. It's written by an Armenian Holocaust survivor from 1918, and he was marched like 1,200 miles without shoes. Everyone in his family died on the way in, and he was an orphan, and he rebuilt his life in the city of Aleppo. And then in 1940, I think it was 1947 or 1957, there was a repatriation from Soviet Armenia to convince Armenians to move back to Armenia.
Okay.
And so his two brothers had moved back to Armenia, and he was really conflicted about leaving the city of Aleppo. So the poem is called Farewell Aleppo. And the photograph I have above it, almost everything in that photograph is completely destroyed. And so it is a very gut-wrenching poem to read in context with, 60 years later.
Thanks so much, Jason.
Thanks for having me.